Good morning and welcome to this first session in the Let's Read for Frankenstein. Now, I already talked about the background on this novel, so there is an introduction for this series. I suggest that you watch that before this, but you don't have to. But if you want to hear me talk about the preface and how this book came to be, then you'll want to watch that before watching this. There is a playlist for this series. It's going to be under Let's Read Frankenstein. So you can check the playlist and find all of the sessions for this book there. Today we're going to be covering letters number 1 through 4 and then the first 4 chapters of the book. So we'll get right into it. Now, one of the things you'll notice in Frankenstein here is that it's called Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. Now, a lot of people probably already know this, but Prometheus was one of the Titans, okay? And there's a story concerning Prometheus in Greek mythology that he tricked Zeus. He put 2 bowls of food in front of Zeus. One of them was it was a stomach that was stuffed with meat, and then the other dish was a bunch of bones that were wrapped in fat. And he told Zeus to choose one for sacrifice. Okay, so Zeus ended up choosing the one that was wrapped in fat and got the bones essentially. And it angered him so much that he took fire from mankind. Well, Prometheus climbed up into Mount Olympus and went into Hephaestus's shop. Hephaestus, who was like the blacksmith of the gods, and stole fire from his kiln and gave it to mankind, which angered Zeus. And then Zeus, in retribution, chained the Titan Prometheus to a mountain in the Caucasus somewhere, where a eagle would come down and eat Prometheus's liver every day. And every night, Prometheus's liver would regenerate, and then this eagle would come down and eat his liver again, over and over. Another myth concerning Prometheus is that Prometheus formed man out of clay and imparted life to him. But needless to say, in both versions of the story, we have this thing about fire, which represents technology being given to man, and then man doing things with it that are the unintended consequences of technology. For instance, man using fire to forge weapons to wage war. But Prometheus is this figure that these romantics, are calling upon and using as a hero in their literature of the time when this was written. And that's why it's titled The Modern Prometheus. So, this is going to be a cautionary tale. It actually opens kind of with a framing device where we have this captain named Robert Walton who is exploring the northern regions up in the North Pole for scientific research or scientific endeavors. We've already covered the preface, like I said, so we'll skip that. But we have this opening letter from St. Petersburg, dated December 11th, 17. We don't know the date, so we just know that this is in the 18th century. And it's Captain Robert Walton. We don't get his name in letter number 1, but he's writing to his sister Margaret. Okay, and he is, we learn from this first letter that he was a failed poet. He says, I also became a poet and for 1 year lived in the paradise of my own creation. I imagine that I also might obtain a niche in the temple where the names of Homer and Shakespeare are consecrated. You are well acquainted with my failure and how heavily I bore the disappointment. So there we find out that he's a failed poet. We skip down a little bit farther here, and he says that he's been accompanying whale fishers on several expeditions in the North Sea. And in fact, he's, twice hired as an undermate to Greenland, and he's learned basically the tools of the trade on how to be a seaman, a sailor. He's apprenticed himself out. He's now getting ready to embark on an adventure. He says here, "My life might have been passed in ease and luxury, but I preferred glory to every enticement that wealth placed in my path." So he's a man of self-education. We learned a little bit more about this in letter number 2 here. Again, this time dated from England rather than St. Petersburg, Russia. A little bit of time has passed. And we find that he's a little bit dejected. He says, "I shall commit my thoughts to paper. It is true, but that is a poor medium for the communication of feeling. I desire the company of a man who could sympathize with me, whose eyes would reply to mine. You may deem me romantic, my dear sister, but I bitterly felt the warmth of a friend." So this Robert Walton, this captain of this vessel, is lonely, and he's looking for friendship with another man of like mind. I think this is going to make him a little bit of a foil, not just for Victor Frankenstein once he enters the story as far as his pursuits in science, but also a foil for the creature. The creature, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but I think this story is well enough known that people realize that the creature is an outcast and is alone. So Robert Walton is going to be able to kind of be, I don't know, like kind of a composite character. If you could take Victor Frankenstein and the creature and fuse them together into one, you would get Robert Walton. At least that's my opinion. Okay, that's what I think about it. But we see that this Robert Walton, he is seeking for glory. He is seeking to make a name for himself and for the betterment of mankind. He, down here on page number 6 in this copy that I have, makes a reference to the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. He says, "I cannot describe to you my sensations on the near prospect of my undertaking. It is impossible to communicate to you a conception of the trembling sensation, half pleasurable and half fearful, with which I am preparing to depart. I am going to unexplored regions, to the land of mist and snow, but I shall kill no albatross. Therefore, do not be alarmed for my safety, or if I should come back to you as worn and woeful as the Ancient Mariner." So this is the reference to the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, which Mary Shelley heard read by Samuel Taylor Coleridge in one of these little, what do you call them, these group gatherings that her father would put together, where he would invite poets and scientific minds and philosophers and stuff of the day to these parties where they would entertain the guests by putting forth their latest theories or reading their poetry or whatnot. And Mary Shelley at a young age actually heard Samuel Taylor Coleridge read the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner live in the flesh. That must have been something pretty spectacular. But in the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, it's a man who's at a wedding at the beginning of this story and begins to regale to a wedding guest his tale of woe concerning how he killed an albatross while they were on a seafaring voyage, and then the ship himself and the crew encountered, peril, the wrath of God or the gods as a result of his wanton act of cruelty in slaying this albatross. So we're going to continue on with letter 3. And it says here that, there's really not a whole lot that happens in this letter. It's basically just an update where he's talking about how the weather is turning harshly. So it's kind of foreshadowing letter 4. So we get to letter 4. And he's now relating to his sister. We're now in August 5th. That's the date of this letter, of 17, whatever year this happens to be. And Captain Robert Walton here says that, quote, "We perceived a low carriage fixed on a sledge and drawn by dogs," so it's a dog sled, "pass on towards the north at the distance of half a mile. A being which had the shape of a man, but apparently of gigantic stature, sat in the sledge and guided the dogs. We watched the rapid progress of the traveler with our telescopes until he was lost among the distant inequalities of the ice. So this is a foreboding figure, very large, immense. Later on, we're going to learn that he's around 8 feet tall. But later in that day, they come across a human being alive who they bring on board the ship, who is pursuing this other man, and he's not in good shape. We don't learn his name at first, okay, right away, but we find out that this is Victor Frankenstein. And he comes on board the vessel, they rescue him. And then the captain here says, once the lieutenant asked why he had come so far up on the ice in so strange a vehicle, his countenance instantly assumed the aspect of deepest gloom, and he replied, to seek one who fled from me. He says, and did the man whom you pursued travel in the same fashion? He says, yes. Then I fancy we have seen him, for the day before we picked you up, we saw some strange dogs drawing a sledge with a man in it across the ice. And so this Victor Frankenstein is going to, well, we'll get to this part later down in this letter. Robert Walton says, I said in one of my letters, my dear Margaret, that I should find no friend on the wide ocean, yet I have found a man who, before his spirit had been broken by misery, I should have been happy to have possessed as the brother of my heart. So he's found this companion. And Victor Frankenstein and Robert Walton are very similar, very much alike in pursuit of glory and in pursuit of scientific endeavors for the betterment of mankind. He continues in his letter, my affection for my guest increases every day. He begins to converse and talk with Victor Frankenstein, and Frankenstein says this, quote, one man's life or death were but a small price to pay for the acquirement of the knowledge which I sought, for the dominion I should acquire and transmit over the elemental foes of our race. Well, actually, this is Robert Walton saying this. So the captain says this. As I spoke, a dark gloom spread over my listener's countenance. So this is Victor Frankenstein hearing Robert Walton, say this thing, and he says, quote, unhappy man, do you share my madness? Have you drunk also of the intoxicating draught? Hear me, let me reveal my tale, and you will dash the cup from your lips. And he says here that he appeared to despise himself for being the slave of passion. So this is a cautionary tale that we're about to embark upon, about men that are unable to temper their passions and control themselves. Okay, it's all a little bit of a tale of obsession, and how obsession and the pursuit of glory and fame can destroy a man. He says further on down, you have hope and the world before you and have no cause for despair, but I have lost everything and cannot begin life anew. So this is Victor Frankenstein's words of warning to Captain Robert Walton. In this last part of the letter here, as we near the end, he says in the part dated August 19th, I imagine that you may deduce an apt moral from my tale. Okay? So this is, like I said, we're getting a little bit of a bonk bonk on the head that this is what this is. It's a tale, a morality tale to warn us. And then Victor Frankenstein is going to relate his story beginning here in chapter 1. So Robert Walton informs us that he is putting to paper this story as it's being spoken to him by Victor Frankenstein. Now, chapters 1 through 4, which we're going to cover here, are going to relate to Victor Frankenstein's research, his upbringing and whatnot, and it will actually end in chapter 5. We're going to stop there. We're just going to cover through chapter 4. So we find out right away that Victor Frankenstein is from Geneva, Switzerland, And he says his family is one of the most distinguished of the Republic, so he is an aristocrat. His father's name is Alphonse. And we find out that his mother, Caroline, is a very pious and devout woman. When Victor is born, they spend time traveling about. He says from Italy, they visited Germany and France. I, their eldest child, was born at Naples, and as an infant accompanied them in their rambles. For several years, he was an only child. Now, in this version of the story, they come across a young girl who they adopt. Her name is Elizabeth Lavenza in this version. Now, this is a revision. In the original story, Elizabeth was Victor's cousin, actually his first cousin. And I guess people were incited or didn't like that, so when she revised the story for the 1831 edition, Elizabeth is no longer Victor's cousin. She is an orphan that is adopted by the family and then raised kind of like his adopted sister, but they still refer to her as cousin. So she's not related by blood. All right, but Elizabeth, it says she was the daughter of a Milanese nobleman. Her mother was a German and had died on giving her birth. The infant had been placed with these people to nurse. And then when Caroline sees this child, she takes the child into her home and is raised as Victor's companion, they said. But the plan for this Elizabeth, who everybody loves, she's a very angelic character in the story, is the plan is for her and Victor to marry at some point in the future. The chapter 2, we have the birth of a second son. Victor now has a companion, of his family's own blood, a brother. It says he's his junior, but of 7 years. And at this time, his parents gave up their wandering life and fixed themselves in their native country, where they lived in a house in Geneva, on the eastern shore of a lake, about a league from the city. And it says he has a best friend here, that Henry Clavel, who is going to be Victor's best friend. This is an important character, who's the son of a merchant. So Victor is an aristocrat, and he becomes friend with this merchant class, a working class guy in Geneva. And Henry Clavel is into like the Arthurian tales, acts of chivalry, reading about the Crusades and whatnot. He's very much into these stories, But Victor very soon becomes obsessed with science. Here he says this, quote, "It was the secrets of heaven and earth that I desired to learn, and whether it was the outward substance of things or the inner spirit of nature and the mysteries of the mysterious soul of man that occupied me, still my inquiries were directed to the metaphysical, or in its highest sense, the physical secrets of the world." Meanwhile, Clerval occupied himself, so to speak, with the moral relation of things. So this is very important. We see that Henry Clerval, Victor's friend, is pursuing ethics, the moral substance of things, while Victor is pursuing science and exploration. So we have already being set up in this tale the pursuit of science without ethics, with no basis of morality whatsoever. Victor tells us here, natural philosophy is the genius that has regulated my fate. And he goes off to reading The Alchemist, alchemy. So alchemy was it was a study of metaphysics concerning the transmutation of, like, for instance, changing lead into gold, of changing one substance's nature into another. So he is pursuing alchemy. His father sees that he's studying this alchemist named Cornelius Agrippa, And Alphonse Frankenstein tells Victor this: "My dear Victor, do not waste your time upon this, it is sad trash." So his father is less than enthused that he's studying these alchemists. He goes on to study with Paracelsus, and then Albertus Magnus, which are more figures that are into alchemy. Albertus Magnus is actually a post-schism Roman Catholic saint. But yeah, he's studying these people that are into, well, alchemy, but some of them are more trending towards the occult. We get down to the bottom of the page here where he says, "I entered with the greatest diligence into the search of the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life." So he's now looking for how to overcome the limitations placed on man, namely death. Okay, which death, at least in Christianity, as far as Christianity is concerned, is a consequence of the fall of man in the Garden of Eden, who transgressed God, thus separating himself from God. And as a consequence of this, death came upon the entire race of man. So Victor Frankenstein is trying to find a way to overcome death. He says here, "What glory would attend the discovery if I could banish disease from the human frame and render man invulnerable to any but a violent death." And he's studying all this stuff, and then he's got this event, this central event happens. When I was about 15 years old, we had retired to our house near Belrive when we witnessed the most violent and terrible thunderstorm. And he sees fire issue from the heavens and completely destroy this tree. And he is just like, looking at this and thinking, if this force of lightning could destroy, what if it could be harnessed and used for not destruction, but for, scientific good? Becomes kind of obsessed with this. Let's see. "Before this, I was not acquainted with the more obvious laws of electricity." He says, "On this occasion, a man of great research in natural philosophy was with us, and excited by this catastrophe, he entered on the explanation of a theory which he had formed on the subject of electricity and galvanism, which was at once new and astonishing to me." So, galvanism at that time, believed you could put electrical current into, for instance, like a frog or a small animal, and it would cause the nerves to react. The frog's legs would move and whatnot. So there was a theory going around that through galvanism, through electrifying inanimate flesh, you could reanimate the flesh by driving electrical current through this process of galvanism into the dead. So this is something that Victor is very much interested in. He says, "I at once gave up my former occupations, sat down, natural history and all its prodigy as deformed and abortive creation, and entertained the greatest disdain for a would-be science which could never step within the threshold of real knowledge. In this mood of mind, I betook myself to mathematics, the branches of study appertaining to that science as being built upon secure foundations and so worthy of my consideration." We have this theme at the very bottom of the last page where Victor says, "Destiny was too portent, and her immutable laws had decreed my utter and terrible destruction." So we have this concept of fate versus free will that's appearing in this. And I do believe that this is a departure. At least people have commented that the 1818 original version, which is much more in the realm of free will, Whereas this version that we're reading here, the 1831, Mary Shelley seems to have switched her stance on free will and is much more into fate. And this probably had to do with the death of a couple of her children, with the death of her husband, Percy. This woman had a life of tragedy, and so began to view the world, I think, with a much more of a dangerous place, and much more less kindly than she did before. She began to view the world as if the powers of fate were upon her. So we'll carry on to chapter 3. We learn that Victor's mother, Carolyn, dies. Elizabeth got sick, and Carolyn died as a result of caring for Elizabeth. And so Victor, here, his mother's last words are, "I will endeavor to resign myself cheerfully to death, and would indulge a hope of meeting you in another world." She died calmly, and her countenance expressed affection even in death. Well, Victor's going to go off to university, and I think it's Ingolstadt is the name of the university, but he says here again, this is another portent of fate. He says, "The angel of destruction which asserted omnipotent sway over me from the moment I turned my reluctant steps from my father's door led me first to, I think it's Monsieur Krempe, professor of natural philosophy." Well, this guy asked Victor about his studies, and Victor tells him that he has been studying, The Alchemist. And he says, "Have you really spent all your time in studying such nonsense?" And Victor replies in the affirmative, "Every minute." And then the Professor Krempe says, "Every instant that you have wasted on these books is utterly and entirely lost. You have burdened your memory with exploded systems and useless names. Good God, in what desert land have you lived where no one was kind enough to inform you that these fancies which you so greedily imbibed are 1,000 years old and as musty as they are ancient? I little expected in this enlightened and scientific age to find a disciple of Albertus Magnus and Paracelsus. My dear sir, you must begin your studies entirely anew." So he doesn't really care for Monsieur Krempe, kind of is taken aback by this, but he finds another professor who is unlike this professor, who actually praises these scientists. This is Monsieur Waldman, Professor Waldman. And when Victor talks to him about these guys, this Waldman says, "The ancient teachers of this science," said he, "promised impossibilities and performed nothing. The modern masters promise very little. They know that metals cannot be transmuted, and that the elixir of life is a chimera. But these philosophers, whose hands seem only made to dabble in dirt, and their eyes to pore over the microscope or crucible, have indeed performed miracles. They penetrate into the recesses of nature and show how she works in her hiding places. They ascend into the heavens. They have discovered how the blood circulates, how the nature of the air we breathe. They have acquired new and almost unlimited powers. They can command the thunders of heaven, mimic the earthquakes, and even mock the invisible world with its own shadows." Such were the professor's words. Rather, let me say, such were the, quote, "words of fate announced to destroy me." So you see here again, Victor is blaming everything on fate. It was just fated. Like, it was fated that I would embark upon this scientific endeavor. It was fated that I would embark on this quest for glory that would ultimately result in my own destruction. And then Victor exclaims, as this professor speaking, he's gripped in ecstasy, and Victor proclaims to himself, "So much has been done," exclaimed the soul of Frankenstein. "Much far more will I achieve. Treading in the steps already marked, I will pioneer a new way, explore unknown powers, and unfold to the world the deepest mysteries of creation." And it's because this Monsieur Krempe had he didn't condemn Albertus Magnus or Cornelius Agrippa or Paracelsus. He actually kind of was like indebted to them and expressed admiration that Victor now will kind of give up these metaphysical pursuits of these medieval type figures and embark upon quest for science. But he's kind of integrating the two schools, natural science and these alchemical figures, kind of their mindsets and whatnot. One of these figures that Victor had mentioned was a man that had studied Kabbalistic ideals. So if you know anything about the Jewish tale of the Golem, right? It's this creature that is animated. It's a creature kind of like I think they even made a movie of it, an old silent film called The Golem, if I'm not mistaken. But a golem is an inanimate creature that is imbued with a life force. So this is something that comes from, I guess you would call it Jewish mysticism or Jewish fables, okay? I don't know if it comes from Kabbalistic school of thought, but there is this idea of the golem that is in these, tales within Judaism. So we're going to embark here on chapter 4. Oh, here we go. The end of this chapter 3. Thus ended a day memorable to me. It decided my future destiny. All right. Victor says here that this lecture had removed his prejudices against modern chemists. So he is embarking in a pursuit of chemistry now. Now, Waldman becomes close friends with Victor, and Victor begins to do his experimentation. He says, I became myself capable of bestowing animation upon lifeless matter. So he's had his first success. And as this goes on, he is experimenting with this, and he says, I began the creation of a human being. So now he's taking his studies and applying them to creation of a man. And he says this would be, quote, a new species would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs. So he is literally like creating a creature in his own image. So he is emulating God, who has created Adam in his own image, if you read the account in the biblical narrative in the book of Genesis. He says, I pursued nature to her hiding places. Who shall conceive the horrors of my secret toil as I dabbled among the unhallowed damps of the grave of the tortured the living animal to animate the lifeless clay. So he's torturing animals and experimenting with dead flesh. It says, a restlessness and almost frantic impulse urged me forward. So this is obsession. I seem to have lost all soul or sensation but for this one pursuit. Go down to the bottom of the page. The same feelings which made me neglect the scenes around me caused me also to forget those friends who were so many miles absent and whom I had not seen for a long time. So we see Victor, this is destroying him, right? He says that a human being in perfection ought always to preserve a calm and peaceful mind and never to allow passion or a transitory desire to disturb his tranquility. So Victor is giving his warning. He's saying that you should never allow your passions to destroy you, that you have to control your passions. And I, being an Orthodox Christian, can totally agree with taming your passions. But again, Victor pursues in his pursuits here. He says, I do not think that the pursuit of knowledge is an exception to this rule. If the study to which you apply yourself has a tendency to weaken your affections and to destroy your taste for those simple pleasures in which no alloy can possibly mix, then that study is certainly unlawful, that is to say, not befitting the human mind. If this rule were always observed, if no man allowed any pursuit whatsoever to interfere with the tranquility of his domestic affairs, Greece had not been enslaved, Caesar would have spared his country, America would have been discovered more gradually, and the empires of Mexico and Peru had not been destroyed. At the very end of chapter 4, where we're going to end today, Victor says this: I appeared rather like one doomed by slavery to toil in the mines or any other unwholesome trade that an artist occupied by his favorite employment. Every night I was oppressed by a slow fever, became nervous to most painful degree. The fall of a leaf startled me, and I shunned my fellow creatures as if I had been guilty of a crime. Sometimes I grew alarmed at the wreck I perceived that I had become. The energy of my purpose alone sustained me. My labors would soon end, and I believed that exercise and amusement would then drive away incipient disease. And I promised myself both of these when my creation should be complete. And of course, in the next chapter, chapter 5, we're going to end here for today. But the creature is going to live. It's going to come on the scene. And we will be covering chapters 5 through, I think we're going to go through chapters 5 through 10. So for the next session, you'll want to read chapters 5 through 10, and we will stop there and we'll talk about it. And I think this is the part where the story is really going to get interesting, because once we get introduced to the creature, this is really where kind of our, warning against, our morality tale, so to speak, our warning about obsession, okay? Victor Frankenstein's obsession, and then his basically being irresponsible, right? Like, we're going to learn about the consequences of things, like the unintended consequences. And I think that this story it remains incredibly relevant today. This Gothic tale, which is considered to be the first science fiction story. Mary Shelley is credited with inventing the genre of science fiction. So anyways, thank you for watching. I hope that you got something out of this. Leave me some comments in the comment section about things that you noticed or things that that interested you about the section we covered today. And, we'll go from there. It's just nice to get some feedback. All right. Thank you for watching, and y'all have a wonderful day.